In the middle of the 17th century, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was a titan of the European continent. Its borders stretched from the Baltic Sea nearly to the Black Sea, encompassing a territory far larger than almost any of its contemporary rivals. But by 1795, that sovereignty vanished. In a series of aggressive land grabs, Russia, Prussia, and Austria absorbed the entire state. The name Poland was scrubbed from the official political geography of Europe. A new Polish state emerged in 1918, but the reprieve was short-lived. In 1939, Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union struck simultaneously, tearing the country apart from both sides and subjecting the population to a dual occupation of unprecedented violence. When land is seized and languages are banned, cultures typically dissolve into the empires that govern them. The institutions that sustain a people, their laws, their armies, their schools, usually disappear with the government. Yet Poland survived a century of total absence and the most destructive war in human history to emerge as one of the most robust economies and militaries in Europe today. How a nation remains a nation without the existence of a state is one of history's most improbable stories of endurance. The foundation for this resilience was laid in 966, when the leader, Mieszko I, chose to accept Christianity. He wasn't just adopting a faith, he was securing formal diplomatic recognition from Western Europe. This strategic move integrated his people into a broader cultural network that would prove far more durable than any single border. That state eventually evolved into the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, a society that stood in stark contrast to its neighbors. While European monarchs were consolidating absolute power and enforcing religious purges, the Commonwealth functioned as a noble republic that protected religious freedom and limited the power of the king. Defending this island of relative liberty were the winged hussars. These elite cavalrymen wore massive feathered frames that howled in the wind during a charge, a psychological weapon that shattered enemy formations long before the lances made contact. But the same decentralization that allowed for such freedom also created a fatal vulnerability: the liberum veto. This legislative rule meant that any single member of the nobility could instantly dissolve the parliament and block any law from passing. Hostile, autocratic neighbors realized they didn't need to win a war to dismantle the Commonwealth. By bribing just one disgruntled noble, the Russian and Prussian empires could effectively shut down the entire Polish government, leaving the country unable to tax its citizens or raise a defense. This paralysis led to the three partitions of the late 1700s. Russia, Prussia, and Austria methodically carved up the territory until, in 1795, the Polish state was entirely dismantled. For the next 123 years, the nation existed only as an idea. With no formal government to represent them, the Polish people had to maintain their identity within their homes, their churches, and their private schools, keeping the concept of a country alive without a single acre of sovereign ground. When armed rebellions were crushed by the Russian czars, the resistance turned to art. Romantic poets and the music of Frédéric Chopin became the new borders of a nation. Their work encoded Polish history and folk traditions into a cultural language that the occupiers couldn't suppress. This cultural insistence reached into the highest levels of global science. When Marie Skłodowska-Curie was forced into exile to pursue her research, she named her newly discovered element polonium, ensuring the name of her suppressed homeland was spoken in laboratories across the world. By the turn of the 20th century, the Polish identity had detached itself from geography.
It had become a collective agreement among millions of people, a consensus that remained intact regardless of which empire claimed the land beneath their feet. That consensus returned to the physical world in 1918. Marshal Joseph Pilsudski led the newly independent state through an immediate test of survival during the 1920 Soviet invasion. He orchestrated a daring defense at the gates of Warsaw, halting the spread of the communist revolution into Europe. But the stability of the new republic was shattered in 1939. Hitler and Stalin signed a secret agreement to once again carve up the nation, launching a dual invasion that trapped the Polish military between two of the most powerful war machines in history. The occupation was an attempt at total erasure. Poland became the site of the Holocaust and a campaign of mass executions targeting the country's teachers, priests, and intellectuals. The goal was not just to govern the land, but to permanently destroy the Polish capacity for self-rule. The response was the Home Army, the largest underground movement in occupied Europe. They maintained secret universities and a hidden judicial system, eventually launching the heroic 63-day Warsaw Uprising to liberate their capital from Nazi control. While the Polish resistance fought, the Soviet army waited just across the river, allowing the Nazis to crush the rebellion. After the surrender, German troops systematically dynamited the city, turning historic Warsaw into a wasteland of pulverized brick and stone. The sheer brutality of the 20th century proved that while cities can be leveled and populations decimated, a culture that has learned to survive without a state is nearly impossible to kill. After the war, the liberation by the Soviet Union transitioned into a decades-long occupation. Poland was sealed behind the Iron Curtain, its economy and politics dictated by the communist regime in Moscow. The government controlled the factories and the media, but they could not break the Catholic Church. It remained the one institution the regime couldn't fully penetrate, serving as a sanctuary for the Polish identity during the darkest years of the Cold War. In 1978, the internal logic of the Cold War was disrupted when a Polish cardinal became Pope John Paul II. His return home in 1979 drew millions into the streets, providing a visual demonstration that the people's collective identity was far more powerful than the state's ideology. This momentum coalesced into Solidarity, a nonviolent trade union led by Lech Walesa. By 1980, it had 10 million members, one-third of the entire working population, effectively creating an alternative society that the communist government could no longer manage. Solidarity's persistent, peaceful defiance eventually forced the government to the negotiating table. In 1989, Poland became the first nation in the Soviet bloc to hold democratic elections, triggering the collapse of communist regimes across Eastern Europe and the fall of the Berlin Wall. Today, Warsaw has been rebuilt into a landscape of glass skyscrapers and restored historic squares. The ruins of the 20th century have been replaced by a surging, modern economy. This rebirth has established Poland as a primary military and political anchor for both NATO and the European Union, a far cry from the paralyzed state that was dismantled 2 centuries ago. The survival of the Polish people suggests that national identity is a collective agreement, one that functions independently of government structures or recognized territory. It is a shared memory that persists even when the physical evidence of a nation is destroyed. Maps are drawn by conquerors, and cities are built by architects. But the millennium-long story of Poland proves that as long as a people choose to belong to one another, their nation can never truly be erased.